Almost unimaginable scenes in Los Angeles. KBC's Chopper giving us a gut-wrenching view of the devastation from multiple fires burning in Southern California.
Pacific Palisades, right now, could just be taken off the map. There is no Pacific Palisades.
It's all burned down. Everything, my kids' school, our community, our neighbors' houses, everything is just burned down. Everything is gone.
Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kshama Sawant. 2025 has begun on a grim note with the inferno raging in the Los Angeles area in Southern California. 5 devastating fires have been sweeping through 40,000 acres of the whole region, swallowing up more than 12,000 buildings so far in their utterly unforgiving blaze. The fires have also killed at least 16 people, and another 13 people are missing. Many wealthy Hollywood homes were destroyed, but working and middle-class families are also among those affected. Pasadena and Altadena, 2 areas engulfed by the Eaton fire, have a rich history of Black community and culture, and the Black community has been hit hard. Many homes go back generations and have been passed down for decades from parents to their children.
Tom Vakar from our sister station in San Francisco is live in Altadena with the latest. Tom, what's it look like this morning?
Have a look for yourself. Now, this is a fire that you need to consider this. Cities and towns evolve slowly. They come and they go, they have more buildings, less buildings, etc. This is the equivalent of a massive heart attack for this town.
The areas were rare places where Black residents could afford homes in the Los Angeles area, especially in the decades after the end of legal segregation. While 3 fires have been contained at the time we are recording this, the Palisades and Eaton fires have only been slightly mitigated. Gusts of wind are expected to pick up again over the weekend, and firefighters were worried that the progress could even be reversed. A Google search on the word apocalyptic will find dozens of articles about the hellscape that has unfolded and is continuing to evolve. For today's discussion on the wildfires, we are joined by Sonali Kolhatkar. Sonali is the host and executive producer of Rising Up with Sonali, a nationally syndicated radio and television program produced at KPFK Pacifica Radio and airing on Free Speech TV. Sonali's book, Rising Up, The Power of Narrative in Pursuing Racial Justice, was published in the summer of 2023, and her new book, Talking About Abolition, A Police-Free World is Possible, is coming out this month. I first met Sonali at the protests outside the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia in 2016. Sonali and her family also live in the Altadena neighborhood in the Los Angeles area, where she has watched in horror as the wildfires have raged. On Strike is so grateful to be able to have Sonali for a conversation with us today. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you know that we bring coverage, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to build our movement against the billionaires and their political servants, and so that On Strike can continue to bring the kind of discussions about strategy needed to fight back and win. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely on donations from working people like you. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Most importantly, make sure to register for the National Organizing Conference Workers Strike Back is hosting in Seattle on Saturday, February 22nd, along with our first in-person Workers Strike Back National Convention on Sunday, February 23rd. Workers Strike Back sends our solidarity to the workers and organizers at the Amazon facility in Garner, North Carolina, who are organizing with Carolina Amazonians United for Solidarity and Empowerment, or CAUSE, and whom we interviewed on this program last year. The 4,300 workers at the warehouse are scheduled to have their unionization vote in February. Workers Strike Back and my organization, Revolutionary Workers, both stand with cause and the Amazon workers courageously fighting against the behemoth corporation. The North Carolina facility workers start at $18 per hour with pay outrageously capped at just $20.90. Cause has set up a public strike fund and has raised nearly $36,000 out of a $112,000 goal. They have consistently taken the stance that all Amazon workers need to fight around strong demands like $30 an hour, no matter where they are located. They have also been calling for a $2 per hour increase in peak bonus and the return of double overtime during peak times, for 180 hours paid time off, paid sick leave, and timely accommodations for injured and disabled workers. According to climate scientists, there is no doubt that the conflagration in Los Angeles is related to and is part of what's playing out before our very eyes. The European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service, also called C3S, confirmed just this past Friday that 2024 was the first full year where global temperatures exceeded pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees Celsius. C3S said that the climate crisis is pushing the world to temperatures never before experienced by modern humans. Climate change has contributed to an increase in the frequency, season length, and burned area of wildfires. One crucial factor in this unfolding disaster has been the lack of rainfall in Southern California in what should be the rainy season. California receives most of its rain from December to February, and right now should have been the wettest months of the year. But the last time Los Angeles recorded rainfall over a tenth of an inch, the threshold that is typically considered helpful for thirsty plants and the reduction of wildfire risk, was May 5th of last year, when downtown LA received just 0.13 inches of rain. The extremely dry conditions caused the vegetation to become extremely parched and therefore highly flammable. Hot Santa Ana winds at over 100 miles per hour have also gusted in from the inland region towards the coast, further dehydrating the vegetation and contributing to the spread of fire. When vegetation is so dry and conditions are so flammable, any spark can start a fire, be it a burning cigarette butt, vehicle, or power line. Human-induced climate change remains the primary driver of extreme air and sea surface temperatures. Despite enormous evidence and increasingly dystopian disasters from wildfires to hurricanes, it is clear the capitalists have no interest in seriously acting to address the climate crisis. The path of climate change has been known for decades: the need to stop fossil fuel production and use and move urgently towards clean, safe, renewable sources. And yet, profit is continually put first, and the capitalist class blocks any efforts to stem the tide of this crisis, which threatens human civilization itself. We saw this again at the annual global conference COP29 last year in Baku, Azerbaijan, which was yet another abject failure. That's why I'm a socialist, because capitalism is not only a vicious, anti-worker, racist system, it is rapidly annihilating the planet. It is imperative that we fight back, that working people get organized, because that is the only way forward. On that somber note, once again, I want to say what a pleasure it is to have Sonali Kolhatkar on our show. Welcome to On Strike, Sonali.
Thank you so much, Kshama. It's a grim pleasure to be on with you, which under different circumstances.
Exactly. You know, Sonali, over the holidays, I happened to read a website listing of disaster movies on Netflix, and it said whether it's earth-shattering earthquakes, world-ending comets, or climate catastrophes, these films offer a thrilling escape into worst-case scenarios that, hopefully, it said on the website, hopefully most of us will never experience. You know, as these wildfires have raged, those last words keep running through my mind as I watch the footage of block after incinerated block, because fewer and fewer people are now able to count themselves safe anymore from the path of climate disaster. You and your family have personally been seeing what it's been like. Can you share with us what you've been seeing and your thoughts?
Well, I had to evacuate with my family last Tuesday night. The winds started very, very early Tuesday morning on January 7th. And when they got very serious, I decided to leave with my parents. They're elderly and disabled. They live in the house behind me. We, at that point, still had power, but we didn't know if we would continue to have power. And I didn't want to evacuate, my mother who uses a walker, my dad who's barely like able to balance with a cane in his hand. I didn't want to evacuate them in the dark with winds that were getting stronger and stronger. So we decided to leave at around 8 p.m. on Tuesday. Grabbed one of the last hotel rooms at a hotel in downtown Pasadena. I live in North Pasadena, 1.5 blocks from Altadena. I fled with my parents. We got there and were standing in a very long line filled with people just like us trying to get these, get settled into this hotel that by then had already run out of rooms, but luckily we had an online reservation. I convinced my husband and my older son to join me because I had taken my younger son with me, and bring the cat. And six of us, squeezed into one room on that first terrifying night, still kind of thinking, well, we'll be able to go back in the morning. And when we woke up in the morning, nothing, things had just gotten worse. And then we started hearing about friends who had lost their homes. Oh, did you hear this one lost their home? And these were people we had just sort of seen recently. They're our friends, our neighbors, our members of our community. Wednesday, my father said, oh, I thought we were going back soon. I didn't bring any of my medications. He's a diabetic, he has high blood pressure. And I tried to get replacement medications at nearby pharmacies. Everybody was inundated and overwhelmed. And so I made the decision to drive back to my house, and it felt like an apocalypse. The sky was orange, the wind was hot, there were embers flying in the air, you couldn't barely breathe. I was lucky I had respirator masks that from COVID times. So I ran in the house, grabbed every single medication I could find of his, and ran back, with barely much else, and didn't know if I was going to be able to see my house again. Then my husband and I came back that evening because we started hearing stories of how the firefighters didn't have enough water to fight the fires. And they were driving by houses that, under normal circumstances, they would have been able to put out the fires. But because they didn't have enough water in their tanks or any water in their tanks, they were letting them burn and focusing maybe on, smaller fires. And so my husband and I were like, we were hearing of stories of people who were returning to their homes and using their hoses to like save their homes, and some were succeeding and some weren't. So we decided, we put our dreams into this house we've lived in for 26 years. So we came back to see if the house was okay, and luckily it was. That's when we pulled out the photo albums and the jewelry and the other important artifacts that we, really, the hard drives holding digital photos from years. And we packed them in suitcases, grabbed everything we could. We set up like webcams because the only way I could go back to the hotel, because we were still under an official evacuation order, was if I could somehow visually see my house and know if it was still standing. Otherwise, I was ready to camp out here and save it. But the air was just too dangerous. So we set up webcams. We went back to the hotel. We just had them like continuously. I was like checking to see if my house, can we see flames through the windows, and more stories coming in of friends who had lost their homes. And then we stayed, and ended up staying a total of 3 nights at the hotel. And then Friday, we knew that they were going to start lifting evacuation orders and making them just warning areas. I'm still in a zone that's considered a warning zone. And the zone immediately north of me is still an evacuation zone. So we came back Friday, late morning, around noon actually, and a couple of hours later, the evacuation order for my zone was lifted. My parents, they're disabled. It's really hard for them to just shower, even in a hotel bathroom, because they have a very disabled friendly home. So they hadn't showered in 3 days. So we came back, we filled our house with the air purifiers that we had from a previous fire area, and kept our masks on indoors till the air started clearing up, and spent all day yesterday clearing the brush from outside our home because more wind is expected. And I'm just walking around and driving around my neighborhood, seeing the apocalypse that has unfolded in my beloved North Pasadena, Altadena area that I've lived in for more than half my life. And I'm heartbroken. I'm just absolutely heartbroken.
Yes, Sonali, we are looking at this secondhand, but it feels all too real, precisely because of the scale of the climate catastrophe. We know that we're not going to remain untouched no matter where in the world you are. There's no way of escaping.
Yeah.
The only way of addressing this is to head on examine the question of capitalism itself, which I want to come to in a second. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, first of all, it's really it's a great relief for me as your friend that your parents are also safe. And it's really also just heartbreaking, because what you were describing about your parents' predicament reminded me of a news item I just watched this morning, where two of the people who lost their lives in this fire were two disabled people, father and son in wheelchairs. I'm sure you read about that. And they were waiting to be evacuated, but they couldn't physically themselves evacuate themselves. And so this really shows how the people who are already vulnerable are going to be the ones in some ways most affected, which also brings me to the question of working class people and what impact it's had on them, working and middle class people and communities of color, marginalized communities. Can you tell me what you've seen in your neighborhood and also overall there?
Yeah, I mean, Altadena is a really interesting place, right? There is this history, as you said in your introduction, of it being a historically Black community. I remember when I first moved here, my husband and I had jobs at Caltech, which is south of the 210 freeway in the south part of Pasadena. And the only place we could afford to buy a house was in the north part of Pasadena, north of the freeway. We'd already been living in this house for a few months because we were renting, and then the guy wanted to sell it. So we decided to buy it because we loved it here. And several people at Caltech were like, "Oh, you were moving to North Pasadena? Oh, that's kind of considered the bad part of town. It's the blackest, brownest part of the area, right?" And for us, that was perfect. So we were like, "Yes, we love this neighborhood." So we moved here in December 1999. We bought 1998. We bought the house a few months later in early 1999, and we could see immediately all our neighbors. There were two elderly Black women living across the street from us. One has since been moved to a nursing home, and I suspect she's no more because it was quite a long time ago. The other one still lives here. To the right of us is a multiracial gay couple with an adopted son, another gay couple that now has moved away, an elderly couple, Asian and white on the other side. So this is the flavor of North Pasadena, Altadena, historic Black communities, Mexican and Central American immigrants, old white hippies who've lived here for generations, like vegan restaurants, and in more recent years, young white gentrifiers, right? Young couples with one child or no children who could afford to live here because the housing prices were rising. And it is an artist, lots of artists. I'm an artist too. Altadena is known for its art tours, uh, farmers market, hiking, pot smokers, business owners, new Thai restaurants, old Mexican restaurants, soul food restaurants. It is an incredible mix of America and immigrant communities, rapidly changing, mind you, but still we were holding on to that character. This is a community where people, as you said, were passing down their houses from one generation to the next. And for many people living here, their house was their biggest asset. And they have lost, so many of them have lost that. Now, some of the newer folks that have moved in here, they will rebuild. They have networks. There's also Hollywood writers that live here, and, B-list actors, maybe even a few A-list actors. But a lot of people in the music industry, a lot of people in the recording industry and in the television and film industry, who are sort of, members of the crew, the sort of working class aspects of Hollywood, live in Altadena as well. And some of them will be able to rebuild. Some of them will move away. Some of them have set up GoFundMes that have raised $100,000. Others have set up, very modest GoFundMes and still haven't raised that much money because it depends on who's in your network. A multi-generational Latino family that is very, very dear to me has lost their home. The mom taught my kids, was their toddler teacher. Her sister was a daycare provider, and I sent my kids to, and their mom was a babysitter for us. They're all thankfully still healthy and alive, but they lost their home that they had had for 55 years. And I don't know if they're going to be able to continue living here, right? Because already we're hearing stories of. Yesterday, I spoke to a Mexican couple that lived on the border between Pasadena and Altadena, and they said a developer had come by offering them money for the property where their house once stood. Kshama, that area, the site of their house looked like Israel had dropped a bomb on it. It looked like Gaza. It was absolutely and utterly horrifying. And they were determined to stay and rebuild if possible, but who knows if they can. So this is a community. This is, if this, depending on your means, you might be able to rebuild and you might not. If you're coming from a poor working class background, low income background.
Yeah, and it's really important to build those connections as well, right? I mean, already, even without the climate catastrophe, as you were describing, and a lot of what you said rang true to me even for Seattle, that even without the climate catastrophe, working class people, poor people, and even sections of the middle class actually are being pushed out of the cities because the rent is skyrocketing and has been skyrocketing for the last decade. And now on top of that, we're facing these bigger disasters. And so just these communities are being hit from all ends. And I think a lot of this brings up the question of who's to blame here, like who's really responsible for all this. And I wanted to begin that discussion with you by saying that in one of your Facebook posts you wrote, I strongly believe that our government should be using all our tax dollars to sustain us and keep us safe, rather than spending it on oil company subsidies and militarism. And in another note, you said, it seems authorities have been more interested in policing Altadena than saving Altadena. Can you talk about what's behind all this and the role of the political establishment and the fossil fuel industry as you see it?
People are still reeling. And when I have asked, who do you blame for all of this, a lot of people don't really want to point fingers, because when they think of who do you blame, they're thinking of who started the fire. And frankly, it almost doesn't matter who started the fire, because the fires will start under these conditions, from a carelessly tossed cigarette butt, a power line sparking, or for that matter, a lightning strike, right? Which we can't control. That's not a human being who has, done anything.
No, that's not the actual cause of this fire.
Exactly. And so when I ask people, who do you think is to blame for this? I think a lot of people are thinking that I'm asking who started this fire. And really, and of course, I'm not probing people because they're traumatized, but in my mind, everything, as I'm interviewing people, I'm thinking to myself, are people going to connect what has happened to them to the climate crisis? Because there's no way this would have happened without. I've lived here 26 years. I remember the rainy season. I also remember the past decade or so of the drought. I remember 2 years ago when it felt like the drought was over because we were starting to get lots of rains. And then in the past year, no rain. And I remember not needing humidifiers in my house, not needing air purifiers. I remember all of that, and all of that has changed and changed and changed. And now we live in an atmosphere that is parched and dry. When I go to bed at night, I see my blankets sparking because there's so much static, because the air is so dry. And there's almost no humidity. All of that is a result of climate change. We do get Santa Ana winds. Those are a natural phenomenon.
Right.
And when we get Santa Ana winds, the purpose of Santa Ana winds, nature's purpose, if you will, is to clear out the dead branches, is to sort of sweep away then clean out the air, and then we'll get some rains, and then we'll get some winds, and we'll get some rains. Now we're just getting stronger and stronger and stronger Santa Ana winds and no rains. That's climate change right there. So, the winds are supercharged by climate change. They normally, fire doesn't go down a mountain, fire goes up a mountain. They were pushed down the mountain by winds that were up to 80 miles an hour, and it was terrifying. And embers were flying miles and miles down into residential neighborhoods. There was there burnt little burnt leaves in my yard, even though my house is standing and nothing burned. Burning leaves flew miles into my yard. That's climate change. So who's to blame? It's the climate crisis. And we can rebuild Altadena, but unless we do something about climate change, nothing will stop the next fire from destroying. My house is standing now. I have zero guarantee it's going to withstand the next Santa Ana winds next year and the year after that, unless we do something about the climate crisis.
Exactly, exactly. We have no guarantees anymore. And we've seen wildfires raging across Canada. In fact, just in the last few years, we've in Seattle, which, you don't think of Seattle as dry or smoky because Seattle is, rainy, and it's a Pacific rainforest region. And yet, even here in the summers, we're starting to see ash on the cars and smoky air. And sometimes it's too hazardous to even go outside because the wildfire smoke is at such a high. And then, on the other hand, you had the hurricanes on the East Coast last year. You're going to have deluge in India. We have seen floods, both floods and also heat waves, and people perishing in both kinds of disasters. And the statistics are completely damning. And there's all kinds of statistics we could quote, but I just wanted to bring a couple here. One is a very recent one, which says that a mere 57 oil, gas, coal, and cement producers are directly linked to 80% of the world's global fossil CO2 emissions since the 2016 Paris Climate Agreement. So just since 2016 and the supposed agreement where all these nation states and the supposed leaders were to have agreed on reducing carbon emissions have gone up. In fact, it's not only these fossil fuel companies, it's the Wall Street banks that underwrite these projects, all the money that is fueled into all of this. And during that period, since 2016, the biggest investor-owned contributor was ExxonMobil, which was linked to 3.6 gigatons of CO2 over 7 years, or 1.4% of the global total. And then close behind that were Shell, BP, Chevron, Total Energies. All of these are massive conglomerates, and they're owned collectively by the billionaire class internationally. So it's not like you can make this about a nationality. This is, capitalism is a global system, and really we have to think about it in terms of class, right? It's the people who are at the top who own these corporations and who have a stake in continuing to pump these fossil fuels. And in addition to all of that, we also saw how the insurance industry, which is also part of capitalism, which is scamming people. Can you talk about what's happening with fire insurance and California, and what is going to be the fate of so many of these people who have lost basically everything they owned?
I mean, it's kind of shocking. I'm in a neighborhood text group with people who are living immediately around me. We're all friends, and so we started communicating with one another right as the winds started, and now the conversation has shifted to what should we claim on our insurance policies in terms of damage, because if you have less than $1,000 worth of damage, is it just worth just paying it out of pocket? Because if you have any claims, they'll take away your claim discount. This person had a huge damage. They had a tree fall on their house. But if we claim it on insurance, not only will they try to deny you, they will drop you next year. Oh, insurance costs are going to go way up. These are the conversations people are having, trying to figure out how to get insurance companies to do what they promised us they would do, what they're supposed to be doing, which is you spend years paying money into your policies, and then when you need it, they try to withhold the money from you, because their business model is not to actually insure your house, it's to figure out how to suck your money into their shareholders' pockets. And so also we heard, I have not vetted this yet, I need to properly vet this, but enough people have told me that their State Farm insurance policies now lack fire insurance, because in some areas, some people's fire insurance was canceled just months earlier, because these insurance companies, they know climate change is real, they're planning for it, they don't want to be left holding the bill for all of the damage that they are predicting is going to come from climate change. So they're slowly and quietly canceling policies or parts of policies that they would normally be responsible for. So we have $1,000 deductible, and we're trying to figure out whether the wind damage to our roof, we should claim it or not. And we have filed for it. If you apply for FEMA assistance, the first thing they want to know is if you have house insurance, homeowners insurance, whether you filed that claim before you ask for FEMA assistance, right? So people who need money right now are having to figure out how to wade through paperwork while picking up the pieces of their lives, when the government should be literally coming around and just handing out like debit cards or whatever, and no questions asked, or at least helping people fill out the paperwork and not making them jump through hoops. Instead, our government is saying, go through the private insurance industry first, and then maybe you'll get help. And maybe they'll come through. Maybe FEMA will come through, which we hope they do. Very soon, we're going to have a Trump administration in power, who we know in his previous administration used the levers of federal government agencies to enact revenge on places like California that he sees as an enemy to his political stance. And so I am terrified of what Trump is going to do to try to basically put Californians in their place and screw us over. So yeah, it shouldn't be like this. We are at the whim of private industry again and again and again.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned State Farm, Sonali. State Farm, in my understanding, canceled nearly 70% of its policyholders in the Pacific Palisades in July of last year. I mean, as you said, they know the climate change and climate catastrophe is happening, but all they care about is their bottom line, not, well, wait a second, the planet is burning up, we need to do something. And, that's the logic of capitalism, unfortunately.
And you know what, Kshama, I think it should be really clear, because I think that people get really people get upset. They're like, oh, can you believe these evil corporations? And my response to that is always, look, corporations are just abstract formations that are designed to take money as wherever they can, make money, and pass it on to their shareholders. It can be neither good nor evil, because it is an abstract institution that we have created, allowed to sustain itself, and it exists at the whim of a democratic government. If we want it to continue making profits at our expense, that is on us. If we want to stop it, if we want to regulate it, that is our decision to make, and we need to make that decision. Corporations will do what corporations do. Why are we letting them? Corporations exist to make money. If we tolerate a system that allows corporations to make money at our expense, we have to change that, right? We can't say, if only the corporations would do better. Why would they? No one's compelling them to do better. They don't have a moral compass because they're not humans. They're built for one thing alone, which is to ensure a maximization of profits. And if we put restrictions on that maximization of profits and put conditions on that maximization of profits, then we can hold them to it. But if we're not restricting them in any way, then our government is basically saying that they are more important than people. So it's not about corporations being evil or good. It's about what are we willing to make them do in our service or not. And right now, we're just allowing them to make money off of us instead of, us being held above them.
Yeah, I mean, that is why we as socialists talk about capitalism, because there can't be a good version of capitalism. It's not like we can hold our breath for a good corporation.
Well, there can be a more regulated version of a capitalism, right? Right now, our capitalism is so deep. Let's start regulating it out of existence, if you will. Let's at least start regulating it, and we don't even do that.
I want to play a clip for you in a second about it, to talk about that. Both, what would it take to pass strong enough regulations to arrest climate change in any meaningful way, and would the regulation be enough in the first place? So, I think both questions are crucial for us to address. But before we come to that, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that this is a systemic issue, and we cannot look for good versus evil corporations, because capitalism as a system is evil. And this is what's going to get perpetuated. And it's also the same story in healthcare, right? Both in the healthcare insurance and the fact that it's termed as insurance and not just healthcare, and the story of what's happening with people whose homes have been incinerated. It's the same thing. I mean, the purpose of the idea of insurance under capitalism and before that under mercantilism was not to help people, but to profit off people's tragedies, as you were saying earlier. And in fact, I wanted to also add another aspect to this crisis of the climate globally and connecting that to how capitalism operates. I mean, some of the other dire statistics that have come out are how the US military has the largest carbon footprint of any institution on earth. And you mentioned Gaza earlier, Sonali, and how the landscape in Pasadena, Altadena looks like it's been bombed, and how Gaza was bombed. And so actually this is so evocative in many different ways, because if you look at the statistics, the war in Ukraine, in which, of course, it's the United States and the European Union, the Western imperialism against China-backed Russia, both two imperialist wings of the global capitalist class. That war is already responsible for nearly 200 tons of carbon dioxide, which is over half of 2022's CO2 increase. I mean, those are devastating statistics. And the Israeli state's genocidal war on Palestine, which is, of course, has the complete blessing of the United States imperialism, has produced more emissions than 16 coal power plants. I mean, these are just dramatic numbers that show how destructive war is. And of course, war is part and parcel of capitalism. It's not, this problem is not going to be addressed by people changing ordinary people changing their personal lifestyles. This is not going to be addressed, in my view, unless we end the system of capitalism itself. And for that, it will obviously be a political struggle. But coming to that, I wanted to play a clip that shows how we can't make sense of all this crisis unless we also look at the political spokespeople, the political representatives of the fossil fuel industry and of capitalism itself. And I'm sure you saw this clip from Democracy Now!, where you had, it's a climate scientist and an activist. I think his name is Peter Kalmus.
Peter Kalmus, yeah, he used to live right here in Altadena. I know him.
It's hard for even scientists to wrap our heads around how everything is changing right now on planet Earth. No matter where you look, the indicators, when spring comes, how hot the winter is, habitats that are moving, ice that's melting. Everywhere you look in the Earth system, including, of course, ocean temperatures and land surface temperatures, you're just on this trend towards a hotter planet and all the impacts that are associated with it. And I don't know what it's going to take for us to stop all these stupid wars and come together and actually deal with the emergency that our planet is in the process of becoming less and less habitable and everything that means. We humanity, we've got a real crisis here and we're ignoring it. Another paragraph they took out of the piece, both the Democratic presidents, President Obama and President Biden, they were very proud to expand fossil fuels. President Obama said, all that oil and gas expansion, that was me, people, right?
I know we're an oil country, and we need American energy, and by the way, American energy production. It went up every year I was president, and that whole suddenly America's like the biggest oil producer and the biggest gas. That was me, people. I just wanted you to.
Right after he was done being president at a lecture he gave at Rice University. And now, of course, we have a Republican president coming into office who says this is a hoax, who's gaslighting the people who are following him.
Both Democratic presidents, Obama and Biden, were very proud to expand fossil fuels. And of course, as you said, Sonali, now Trump is at another level in terms of even denying that there is a climate crisis. So in other words, my question was, how do working people proceed forward when both parties that have the power, political power in US capitalism, are beholden to fossil fuel interests, where literally you have Democratic presidents boasting that they are the spokespeople for the fossil fuel profits?
Yeah, I mean, Biden, Obama, all of them have boasted about this. Under Biden, we saw the biggest increase in, I believe it was LNG terminals, and I've written about this, and I'm sort of forgetting now about the statistics. But yeah, you're right. Both of them have boasted about it. I remember during Obama, they were touting fracking as a was a way to like transition away from fossil fuels because they were sort of claiming that it was cleaner than traditional petroleum, and they just basically they talk about it in terms of energy independence, like the United States basically going from depending on oil and gas resources from other countries to producing its own, as if that's a big victory because now we don't have to be beholden to other countries and the whims of global politics to have our unrestricted access to oil and gas. And now we're exporting it. This is not a victory for anybody except for the fossil fuel industry. I think the only way that we can really ensure that we have homes to come back to again and again is to absolutely and unequivocally demand from politicians what we want, right? Like corporations, politicians are they go where the political winds blow. They go where we force them to go. We have to absolutely shut down the country and demand action on climate change. Now, some of us will put our backing on political parties. Some of us will put our backing into doing our best to hold existing politicians accountable. Some of us will adopt an inside outside strategy where we might run for office under existing political infrastructure, hoping that they'll allow climate justice activists to be elected. However people approach it, I think we have to approach it with real militancy to say this is our future versus their profits. And I think making those connections is really, really critical. Instead of saying we want action on climate change, say, okay, our futures versus their profits. You choose because it's one or the other. These things are inextricably linked. I've submitted an op-ed to the LA Times that it's saying it's considering publishing about Altadena, and I put it in those terms. I hope they consider publishing it in the end. And I'm waiting and waiting for them to do so, but I put it in those terms. It is our lives versus their greed, right? These things are not separate. It's not like, oh, they can keep earning profits while we find ways to keep living. Either we live and they die, or they live and we die. That is the equation. And so we, the people, versus they, the corporate institutions and billionaires. The choice is very clear for the majority of we, the people, but people aren't thinking about it in these terms. And also a lot of people, especially those who are, we live at a time when our sort of cultural moment is scaring off a lot of people. They don't want to talk politics. They're scared to talk about politics. They think, oh, we have this politically polarizing moment. I just want to talk about rebuilding my home. I don't want to talk about politics. Once we start talking about like Trump and the Democrats, then it gets too hairy. And let's not politicize this tragedy. I'm already seeing those responses, and that's frustrating because we're not. These aren't isolated incidents that are happening. We're not struggling because some magical fire goblin decided to destroy your home. There are real causes and effects and reasons for why people's homes.
I mean, if there's a fire goblin, it's capitalism.
Exactly. There's a fire goblin, and it's the fossil fuel industry and the capitalist system that enables it, right? So I'm worried that people are not going to want to address the long term. So they're in the short term, the people are very wary of developers, which I love that instinct. There's a strong anti-corporate instinct from people on the ground about corporate developers, regardless of the political persuasion, because they remember when the recession, the Great Recession happened, and developers came in and scooped up properties that went that where people couldn't afford to, for people who had upside down mortgages, and then turned around and rented them, and it kept increasing rents. So they remember that. So they're wary of corporate developers. Now, how to expand that, how to shift our culture to expand that anger and that negative feeling toward fossil fuel producers, that remains our challenge. Because ordinary people, a lot of them, they don't really want to think about it, because then it gets into these politicized, oh my God, I'm not on Trump's side, I'm not on the Democrats, blah, 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 because they don't feel like they have any good options and they get scared about it. So I hope that as a journalist, I can help to shift that culture.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that we need militancy and we need to shut down the system in order to actually force these powerful entities to act. But I think it also brings up the question that you had referred to earlier about whether capitalism can be regulated and what would it even take to bring about any meaningful regulation. What are your thoughts on what it would take to uh, win any kind of change within capitalism, because clearly it's not working. Whatever people are doing right now is not working. We know
Yeah.
that the Democratic and Republican parties and the billionaire class have no interest in addressing this crisis. And the way these political parties function, obviously, there are lots of people who are directly taking money from the oil and gas industry, including so many of the Democrats in the Democratic dominated Assembly and Senate of the California legislature, including this woman who's called Big Oil Blanca Rubio. And even if an occasional Democrat does not take money directly from the fossil fuel industry, ultimately, if you as a politician tie your own personal career advancement to a party that is tied to capitalist interests, ultimately you're going to bend to them.
Yeah.
And so, given this situation, what is it that you think that working people should do?
I think I see great progress in our culture shifting on healthcare, right? Sometimes we have these like turning point moments when a health insurance CEO was killed. It unleashed such widespread outrage in the public and glee over the killing of this human being who they saw as symbolic of an industry that has destroyed so many lives, that has been a cultural moment for us to shift the conversation to a publicly backed healthcare system. I'm hoping that this tragedy will help us shift our dependence away from corporate America and to our own tax funded programs. So, one way for us to start chipping away at capitalism is to say, well, why should we rely on insurance companies to help us rebuild in the future? There's plenty of money we're already paying in taxes. Why shouldn't we start diverting money away from militarism into the climate resiliency? That's just one entry point into upending our dependence on capitalism, right? We already have publicly funded goods, our public schools and our public libraries. Let's keep building on that. If we have public schools and public libraries, why not publicly funded healthcare? Why not publicly funded fire safety? Why not? Our fire departments are publicly funded institutions. They were overstretched, underfunded, and had, and need so much more that we're relying on incarcerated firefighters and firefighters from as far away as South Africa or other countries to come and relieve us because we aren't putting enough resources into that. So one way that I think will be politically expedient and politically received well and doable and achievable is for us to say, let's make more things publicly funded. And the more you make things publicly funded, the less space there is for corporations to take up what they call market share. Get them out of healthcare first. Let's get them out of delivering medication. Let's get them out of fire safety. Let's get them out of these arenas of our day-to-day lives that they have no business being in because they shouldn't be trying to make a profit off of it. And if we keep at it, if we keep going down that path, we may find ourselves in a place where capitalism is very small scale.
I mean, to your point about the responses from the vast majority of working people who say that the reason there was this incident, of the killing of Brian Thompson, the healthcare executive, was very much related to the exploitation by the healthcare industry and the billionaires there of ordinary people in their most vulnerable moments. I totally agree with you that there is that moment, But the truth is that, for example, Medicare for All has been enormously popular for years with working people. I totally agree that this is also, that is, this whole moment has made it even more pivotal, and I have no doubt the California wildfires is going to make that even more potent in people's minds. But I think ultimately it will come back to the question of movement strategy and what kind of leadership we need, because we know that winning any of this, let alone big ticket items like Medicare for All and massive shifts that we need to arrest the climate catastrophe, will require all out class war by working people against the rich and their two parties, because they go on all out war against us. And as you know, I can speak with personal experience because I was on the city council for 10 years in Seattle, and we won historic victories like making Seattle the first major city to win the $15 minimum wage. We won the Amazon tax, which actually just last year raised incredible amounts of money for affordable housing. We have won unheard of renters' rights, but every single battle was hard fought and hard won because the billionaire class, the Democratic Party, which owns the city of Seattle, in terms of, the political landscape, all of them went on all out war against us and against me personally. There was even a recall campaign, which they lost. But the point is that ultimately, it'll take that kind of war. It will obviously take the labor movement to show leadership, which means we need a rank and file uprising in the labor movement, especially posing the need for a just transition for the fossil fuel workers away from that industry into clean energy, right? I mean, because oftentimes, unfortunately, the labor leadership becomes party to these problems. And this has happened a lot in California, where they have joined, the labor bureaucracy has joined the fossil fuel industry by making it a false question of jobs versus, renewable energy, which obviously it's a false premise. We're not going to have either if we don't have.
I think, Kshama, for me as a journalist, I see my role in this fight that you are in as a strategist and an activist. I see my role as a culture shifter, right? Because I feel that so last year my book was about shifting narratives on race and racial justice. And the follow-up book that I'm hoping to write next is about shifting culture on economic issues, which very much intersect with racial justice. And for me, we exist in a space where the stories that we tell about how things work shift our attitudes towards making change possible. And we are so ripe for culture shifting on economic issues that we need our main storytellers, our filmmakers, our TV writers, the places where we get our stories that inform our worldview, to start shifting it away from capitalism, to cast a critical eye towards capitalism and into, as you were saying, this idea of a working class war, right? For example, people whose house burnt down, they watch shows like Queer Eye, or they watch shows like what was that show, Loot on Apple, and they watch TV shows that paint wealthy people as saviors of people who are struggling. And that goes down to like the writers' rooms in Hollywood. People read their newspapers where they read and they're told that the health of the stock market is equivalent to the health of their bottom line. And they internalize these stories that are being told over and over again about our economy. So for me, my big challenge as a journalist, and the challenge of other journalists, is how do we start, and the challenge of storytellers is how do we start shifting our culture away from capitalism as a system that is saving us, and realizing that we are all dying under capitalism. We are being squeezed and strangled under capitalism. So that is where my mind goes, and where I feel like my strength is, and where I want to aim my work towards. And the book that I have that's just coming out, called Talking About Abolition, a Police-Free World is Possible, is going in that direction, where how do we start challenging the way in which we drop our budgets in terms of the money we put towards policing and prisons versus the money we put towards things that actually keep us safe. So that's what I'm hoping, and that's what I see as my role in what I hope will be an economic transformation of our country within my lifetime.
Yes, and in fact, the ecological clock demands that some massive shifts happen in our lifetimes. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
the future generations are completely screwed.
Yeah.
I don't think we can address the climate crisis without actually taking corporations into democratic public ownership. And that doesn't mean that everybody is going to agree with every single thing at step number one. But the point is to begin building militant movements to win things that can take that, as you said, the narrative forward. And that is really crucial. And in fact, throughout time, when you see these narratives shifting, like, I often think of the 70s as an example of that. When you see those narratives shifting in stories and films and media, that's actually in many ways a bellwether for the movements on the ground. It's sort of reflecting that shift in millions of people's thinking. And so I think I see them as interlinked, both actual movements and the stories that are being told and shared, and what's considered a valid narrative, what's considered a valid story, right? So
Yeah,
thanks so much for all your work.
Yeah, I mean, and there are some shifts, like there are some ways in which people are shifting their views, and writers' rooms are changing the tone of their stories. It's not enough. You see shows like Succession that paints white billionaires as the evil people they are, in opposition to, there's a very disturbing trend. Kshama, I don't know if you've seen, and I write about a similar one in my book, Rising Up, where Hollywood loves to portray propaganda, and one of the ways in which they make police seem more positive is by casting Black people as police. Hollywood has a new trend where they're casting Black people as very wealthy or billionaires, right? Maya Rudolph as the billionaire heiress in Apple TV's Loot. Wealthy Black families are a lot more prevalent on television than they are in real life, but that's a way to make capitalism seem like it's multiracial, just as Hollywood paints policing as multiracial.
And it also, actually, Hollywood also paints policing as a noble profession, like, they really care about the poor, they really care about working class people.
And that's because most of the writers are white, whose personal experience is that cops protect them, right? People write what their personal experience is, and so they write these stories.
Completely. I mean, the stories that are missing are the kind, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, Sonali, but when I was arrested because we were fighting for Alaska Airlines and Delta Airlines to comply with the $15 law that we had actually won in SeaTac in a neighboring city. And when I was arrested, I spent the night in the jail cell with 8 or 9 other women. And you won't believe it, every single woman there, literally every single woman there, was there for a crime of poverty. And most of them were because they had got parking tickets or some other, very benign tickets, traffic-related tickets. They couldn't pay them because they were poor. The interest got accumulated. They couldn't pay the interest, obviously. And they were in jail because they hadn't paid their back tickets. I mean, it is just insane. But you don't see these stories in the cop shows. And, I don't watch fantasy films and fantasy shows. And my friends often ask me, why don't you watch? And I often joke, well, I watch a lot of mystery and detective shows. And I say that, well, that's fantasy because that's not what's happening in real life. So
exactly. I mean, so as somebody who lives in Southern California, where these, which is the epicenter of where many of these stories are told, I really feel like it is one of my challenges to start convincing our writers' rooms to diversify, and not just along racial lines, but along economic lines. But it's so much of these battles are around culture, right? And within the realm of culture.
Yes, and the link to how economics affects people and the need for capitalism to carry out divide and rule. So, demonize, if you're poor and your life sucks, demonize your gay neighbor, your Black neighbor, or your immigrant neighbor, right? And keep working class people divided.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was the Trump election was based on, don't look at the billionaires who are screwing you over. It's those immigrants, it's the trans people. Forget the billionaires who were front and center in the campaign. It's the fault of the immigrants. And it's, so, and I
Yeah.
wrote about that leading up to the election. It's like your immigrants are the people actually like helping you live your life, and billionaires are the ones that are helping you toward your death.
Completely. And then unfortunately, of course, the tragedy of the whole election cycle was that on the one hand, you had Trump, and then you had Biden and then Harris, who are also shelling for the same billionaire class and boasting that, oh, I'll build the border wall.
Yeah. Oh,
I'll
yeah.
fulfill that promise.
And
So
partying with celebrities, and people just sort of fulfilling the stereotype of hobnobbing with the liberal elites. I mean, that was such a, it was so out of
it's obscene.
so
Yeah,
out of
completely.
touch with anyway.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Sonali, for spending this time with us. And we will continue to follow this story and perhaps have you on again if you're available to do a follow-up on this.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Kshama, for your work.
Take care, and likewise. One of the reasons Workers' Strike Back is so important is because there is already broad recognition of the urgency for fundamental change. As Sonali and I talked about, there is widespread support for Medicare for all and a recognition that we need a rapid move to renewable energy, that both the Democratic and Republican parties represent the billionaires, and there's a widespread anger at the rich. But that's not enough. The reason the billionaires, the capitalists, are able to continue setting the planet on fire is because they own everything. That is why we need to fight to bring the big corporations into democratic public ownership. And they need to be run democratically by workers, with industries run according to a rational democratic plan instead of a system run for the greed of the few. We can't control what we don't own. Culture change flows from the militant movements of working people fighting back. We need to fight the rich. As working class people, we need to get organized in the millions to fight for fundamental radical change and for an end to the rule of the billionaires, for an end to the existence of the billionaire class. If you're watching and you agree, you should join Workers' Strike Back. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member and register today on our website for our organizing conference on February 22nd and National Convention on February 23rd, both in Seattle. Solidarity.